Hey, once again, folks, welcome to the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast. We are here today with Barbie Casey from Small Ruminant Consulting. Unfortunately, Matt was not able to be on the call with us, so we are going to just roll along without him, I guess. We've been getting those listener questions, and we had a question come in that we thought it would be good to get a nutritionist on to talk about. And we're hoping that Barbie can answer some of those questions for us today. So maybe to get started, Barbie, why don't you give us an introduction to yourself and maybe your background, and then we can take a look at this question.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I grew up, my parents raised cattle, and I decided, I just didn't want to do the cattle. I'm a short gal, and they intimidated me. So at the age of 6, my family decided to get sheep and start some 4-H projects, and that's still going today. We've raised several different breeds of sheep, and mainly meat focused. As many folks see, there's a lot of learning process along the way. I, like many of you, have learned the hard way on many things, and so experiencing that has really helped me. So I went to college, went to Wilmington College in Ohio, and received a degree in agriculture, animal science, and biology. And then decided to continue my education with a master's degree in ruminant nutrition at Michigan State University. And there I worked extensively with dry distillers grains from the ethanol plants. And so you may hear me refer to that as DDGs. Worked with multiple species there, being part of the grad student base. And so really enjoyed that, but got out of grad school and worked in the corporate world for some animal nutrition companies from 2010 to 22. And so in that, I worked with dairy cattle, beef cattle, and small ruminants, sheep, goats, and deer. And, I decided in 2022 that it was time to start my own business. Saw a gap in the industry, and a lot of those big companies can't necessarily meet the needs of every person, especially because many of them are very regional. And so it's difficult to meet the needs of all the folks in the business, especially small ruminants. Being that they eat a whole lot less than beef cattle or dairy cattle, there are usually tonnage limitations, and large companies don't always want to reach out to those smaller species. So started the business in 2022 with a goal of advancing small ruminant nutrition one farm at a time. So I treat every farm like it's my own. And so the focus there is consulting with producers on management and nutrition being the focus, and also troubleshooting and helping them to reach whatever goals they want to reach. Some of my farms range in size from 5 head to 1,000 plus head. And we have dairy sheep, dairy goats, and meat sheep and meat goats. So a little bit of a wide array there. Also working with some deer and some manufacturers on developing various products. So grass-based confinement, the whole lineup there. We are not limited, and what's awesome is we can work with customers based on what's available in their area, rather than recommending a single product. So I really enjoy it.
Good. So maybe before we get into the question, and we can decide if we're going to keep this, you have a universal feeder, right?
I sure do.
So if I introduce that fact, would you talk about that just a little bit briefly?
I can a little bit, yep.
So Barbie, we learned to know you, I guess, Kevin, maybe one of our sales guys, somehow learned to know you. How did that happen? Somewhere in the sheep and goat world, I guess.
Yeah, Kevin and I connected paths. Honestly, I don't remember how, but
Yeah.
somehow we connected paths. Um,
Right.
it may have been
So,
at a livestock show.
yeah, something sheep and goat related, probably.
Yes.
So, being this call is sponsored by Lost Creek Wholesale, the universal feeder distributor here in US and Canada. Maybe we should talk about that feeder that you have just a little bit. What are your thoughts on it by now? What model do you have?
Uh, the model is a good question. I do not know that
Is
the
it
model.
closer to 3 feet wide or 4 feet wide? Like the
It's three
feed.
feet wide.
So you probably have the 500. You're the 500 then.
Yes. That rings a bell. I apologize.
No, that's
Um,
fine. So what are you
yeah,
feeding sheep or goats with it?
so I'm feeding sheep, put that out with a group of feeder lambs that are going to be just sent to market here, in a few more weeks. But that feeder has allowed us to, number one, we don't have to feed every day. It's allowing us to free up our time um, and feed less groups. It also allows us to put more animals in a group with less space on feeders. Rather than having a bunk line feeder with a certain amount of space per head and needing to spread that out and feed twice a day, we can fill that up however often we need to. And obviously that's variable because we have changed it depending on their sizes and how much we want them to get. But we have been able to limit them to 1 pound a day, 2 pounds a day, 3 pounds a day of grain. And they are doing very well. They're not gorging themselves on feed, a couple times a day. Instead, they're taking their turns going to the feeder. We don't have as much bullying to get to feed. And so we're ending up with a much more consistent, uniform group of animals. And
Good.
I would say less digestive upsets as well, because we aren't, and the nutritionist in me knows that that's because we aren't spiking rumen acid levels at different times because of consumption in large amounts. We're feeding multiple little amounts over time. And so as a nutritionist, I love it. My parents, they love it because they are not having to go out in the middle of a group of 20 head of feeder lambs and, having to feed them twice a day. Instead, they just check the feeder every so often to make sure it's not low.
Right. The animals stay a lot quieter, don't they?
They do. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that's because they're not dependent on, they know feeding time comes at, 7 a.m. and 5 p.m.
Right.
They're not noisy around those times because they're getting their feed, over a consistent period, and they don't have to wait on us.
Right. Yeah. What are you feeding in it? What type of feed? Pellet or?
I have a textured feed that I made up. So it's a mixture of pellets, whole corn, oats, some molasses, couple pellets actually. So it's a combination textured feed.
Sure. Good. Good. So why don't we go ahead and get right into this question?
Sure.
So we had the question come in. First of all, this gentleman said he's enjoying hearing the discussion that we have on the podcast. He likes it. And he said he'd like to hear some discussion on what makes a good feed to fatten out kids and what makes a good feed to supplement does. He also had some questions about if he gave a scenario, if his hay is 10% protein and my feed is 14% protein, I'm wanting my does that are kidding to get 12%. Basically, how does he look at all that and balance that all out? And I'm not sure, are you prepared to talk to specifically about goats or goats and sheep?
I can do either.
I think you can look at both options. So what are your thoughts?
The question on supplementing and and what's a good feed. So I like to tell folks there are 100 different feed rations out there, and 50% of them will work for you on your farm. The challenge is finding what feed works for you. What works on one farm may not work on another farm. I think what really needs to be considered heavily is we're all in this for profit. And so economics need to be taken into consideration. Unless you are a show, herd, or flock that has unlimited funds and you just want to push to get to that goal, and you want to use a pre-packaged show feed and all kinds of supplements, I mean, that is great. I have used those. I still use one of the show feeds on my farm because I do show sheep. So there is a time and a place to use each one of the feeds. One thing I would say is it's important to distinguish between a creep feed, a grower feed, and a finishing feed.
So right. I was hoping you would break that out like that.
Yeah, so it's different for sheep and goats. So I'm going to generalize a little bit, but your creep feeds are typically going to be a little finer textured. They're going to typically have a little more flavoring in them. They might be more moist in terms of molasses. If they're pelleted, they're just going to have a little more flavoring in them. And they're also going to have a higher protein and higher level of energy, as well as vitamins and minerals. So one thing that folks ask me all the time is, well, how do I know the energy? Well, if you look at a tag on a bag, you can look at the fat content, but that doesn't tell the whole story of energy. So starch is a form of energy as well. But generally, when we're looking at a tag, fat is your best indicator of energy without doing some more digging. So typically, the creep is going to be your most potent product you can find in a small package, because we know those kids and lambs just need to eat smaller amounts. The most they might be eating is a pound, and they need to get as much as they possibly can to start developing that rumen. We're going from feeding them milk to their first feed, which is essentially like a baby food we'd give to a toddler. So we need to adjust them and adapt their stomach from using the abomasum compartment solely on milk fed to using solely the rumen with grain and hay and forages. So that's a very, very important feed. I recommend all farms use a creep feed. Then we want to switch, I like to say about 2 weeks after weaning, to a grower feed. And the reason I say 2 weeks after, if you want to switch 2 weeks before, that's okay. But that time frame, when you switch a feed, that is adding stress. And so by adding all that stress at weaning time, we're just compounding stress on top of more stress. And it's not going to make your weaning process go smoothly. And you're typically going to lose more weight and more progress by changing everything at once. So right. That's where the 2 week time frame comes in. And I recommend people change feeds over a 2 week period, no matter what you're doing, minimum 2 weeks on a feed change, just because we have to remember we're feeding the gut. We're feeding the bugs in the rumen, not necessarily the animal. And so allowing those bugs to adapt without upsetting them is very important. That's something I like to focus on. But let's go back to the grower. So the grower feed then is the next step after the creep, and that's going to be a little less potent in terms of we're going to expect them to eat 2 pounds a day, not a half a pound or 1 pound. We're going to expect them to eat maybe up to 4 pounds a day. So typically, I expect them to eat, 3 to 4% of their body weight. And I would expect that grower feed is going to be a lower protein and a little less potent, like I said, on vitamins and minerals. But the energy level is going to be a little different too. And some of these are going to depend on the region, the grower or the creep or the finisher feed, the level of energy you need in a region that your average temperature is 75 or 80 degrees versus one that is 40 degrees. That is going to be very different. The temperature and heat stress or cold stress are really going to affect your energy needs. So that's something to look at. But typically I feed a grower feed until they're about, well, on lambs, I would say till they're about 100 pounds. And then I'll switch to a finisher feed, which is a lower protein again, because we're lowering the protein. We've developed that muscle, and now it's time to put some fat on them. And I'm specifically talking more towards meat sheep right now. But we want to put that fat, that cover finish, to get them nice and get them to the market, because that's what protects that meat in the process.
On these different levels of, you're talking about a creep feed, a grower, and a finisher. Do you have any protein levels that you want to attach to any of those? And I also wondered about, when you say feed your creep feed to 2 weeks after weaning, how many days of age are you thinking of weaning when you're talking about that?
Yeah, so on weaning, I typically look at weaning at 60 days. Now, I will say, if we're talking a dairy operation, those are going to be very different. So let's just talk meat operations for now, because dairy operations, if we're removing the kids or the lambs from mom at birth and artificial rearing those, that's really going to change all of it in terms of levels of nutrition. So typically on a lamb feed, a creep feed, I'd like it around a 19% would be ideal for me. However, if you wanted to do an 18% creep, you could. I've seen a 20%, but I think in today's world, with the forages we typically feed, it's a little too high in protein. We get too much ammonia out of that. So typically a protein around 19 would be good for a creep feed. Then on a grower feed, I'm going to say a 17 to 18% protein, and then a finisher anywhere from a 14 to a 16% as a finisher. Now, we're really focused on protein there. Energy is a whole nother concept that is also equally as important. So, if you're looking at pre-bagged, pre-made products, it's easy to look at the target at the protein and start there. Certainly, I make up all kinds of diets on a regular basis that are different from what most folks put in a bag. But in terms of a creep feed, many of my producers will buy a pre-made creep feed, and it's usually going to be that 18 to 19% on lambs. On kids, your creep is typically going to be around a 16%. And the grower will be there about the 16% as well. Finisher on a goat is going to be closer to a 14% protein.
And why is that? I've heard that before, but I wondered, Reddy, why, like on the creep feed, why is a goat's requirement less for a small kid like that?
Yeah, my personal opinion is that we're feeding different types of growth, different muscle amounts, and different levels of growth. You know, we're feeding a kid that's growing to, you know, we might have a market weight much lower than a lamb. And so the different stages of growth are different for each species.
So a goat doesn't normally grow as fast as sheep. Lambs will usually outgain a kid, right?
Correct.
Some of that, I have to wonder if that has something to do with how much selection pressure has been put on that in the sheep versus the goats.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think some of it has to do, you know, those of you that have watched the goat industry grow over the last 20 years in the US, it's changed dramatically. You know, specifically look at the boar goats. They are nothing like they were 20 years ago. And so nutrition has significantly changed for them as well. And specifically in the show industry, they are becoming more and more like sheep in terms of feeding. It's really important that we look at what breed we're feeding and what our expectations are and what frame sizes we are feeding for.
Sure. Yeah. Very good.
I guess the next big question is, this caller had us a question about balancing for protein.
This call is sponsored by Lost Creek Wholesale, your universal feeder distributor in US and Canada. Looking for a way to supplement your livestock with ease? Consider a saliva lick feeder. Universal Feeders saliva lick feeders offer the ability to restrict livestock's intake to a preset amount, determined by the adjustment bar depth and width on the feeder. By narrowing the width and depth of the feed in the groove, this gives us the ability to limit the amount of feed that will stick to a sheep, goat, or cow's tongue. Using Universal Feeders' patent-pending easy adjustment system and saliva lick feature, we can limit sheep and goats to less than 1 pound per head per day and cattle to approximately 6 pounds per head per day. We also offer creep gate attachments for both small lambs and kids. Visit our website at www.lostcreekwholesale.com to find a dealer near you or give us a call at 717-310-3641.
So, one thing I want to stress is forage testing is so important. It is more important than probably anything you'll do nutritionally because it will help you balance everything. The majority of a ruminant animal's diet is going to be forage based. Now, that is more difficult with pasture. Certainly that's where a nutritionist like myself comes in to help you figure that out. But let's take this example. We had an example of a hay that is 10% protein and a grain that is 14% protein. So before we even start out, know that we're using as fed numbers. And by that, I mean, this is the number exactly like the hay is, exactly like the grain is. If we use a dry matter basis number, that is all moisture removed. So I like to compare it as if we were dehydrating apples, oranges, and bananas. There is a very different amount of moisture across those fruits. So the orange, having a lot more juice in it, is going to have very little dry matter compared to the others. But once we dry them down and take all the moisture out, we are comparing them very equally. So as a nutritionist, I like to use the dry matter basis. But when we're running these numbers for crude protein amounts for mixing feeds on the farm, we can just use an as-fed basis, especially if we're looking, we're not using a wet forage. So let's take that hay and grain and assume that we want a 12% overall diet for our protein level. So what I would do is I would take the hay at 10% and subtract the 12% goal, and we get a -2. Now, don't worry about if it's positive or negative. Throw those out the window if it's negative. Just use the number 2. Then remember that for later. We're going to switch to the grain. The grain is 14%. We're going to subtract our goal of 12%. And we also get 2. So then what we do is we take the 2 from our hay number and the 2 from our grain number and add that together. We get the number 4. So we're basically going to need 2 parts hay and 2 parts grain to make our total. But if we were using different numbers, it would be a lot more complicated. But what I would do then is take each of those 2's, divide it by our total number combined. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. I'm going to take our hay number of 2, divide that by 4, and then multiply times 100, and I get 50% of the diet. So on the grain, I'm going to take that 2 number again, divide that by our total of 4, multiply times 100, and I get 50% again. So the easy answer is hay at 10%, grain at 14%. I'm going to feed 50-50 to get a 12% protein diet.
Well, he picked easy numbers. He picked
we
really
did
easy
pick numbers. Yeah, yeah. So what makes it more complicated, though, is remember we're feeding by pounds, not volume. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's really difficult. But here's the catch. What this doesn't include is your energy amounts, which is huge. Hay at 10% to me is a really possibly low quality hay. So I wonder, is it STEMI? So maybe they won't eat all of it. Is it just your grass hay? Is it first cutting? Is it very mature? So maybe digestibility is lower and maybe they won't get much out of that. And does it have any energy in it?
So 10% hay. What is straw? 8? It's like that's what's value? What's book value on wheat straw?
That's a good question. And I will I'm gonna pull out a chart here and tell you a couple numbers just so that you have an idea. But that is absolutely the kicker that gets everybody every time. When we look at hays, it's very different. You have very, very different values for something like an alfalfa hay versus a Timothy hay versus orchard grass, brome grass, bluegrass, ryegrass, just fescue grass. So for example, orchard grass hay late bloom. So we'll say everything has bloomed and all of a sudden you're going to cut it in the field. The protein may be 7.6. If it's early bloom, so you might see 1/3 of the field blooming when you cut it, that's 13.4% protein.
Almost double.
So yeah, so the timing on when you cut the hay is very, very different, and the digestibility is very different. So you might hear the words TDN, total digestible nutrients. And for example, on that same hay, the late bloom with the 7.6 protein is a 49 TDN. The early bloom is a 58 TDN, which tells me it's much more digestible on early bloom. The animal's going to get a whole lot more out of it. It's also going to be more tender, and they're going to want to eat more of it. It's also going to be more compact and better for those late gestation animals that can only fit so much in their body. So, but to answer your other question, Timothy hay, we have some similar ranges. Alfalfa hay may range anywhere from 12% upwards of 24% protein. There could be bluegrass at 5% protein. Ryegrass, if it's not cut and we're talking pasture, early growth in the pasture, might only be 2.8%. So that's where I say it is so very important to test your forages and get an idea of what you have, because you need to know protein, but you really need to know your energy values too. And yes, it is very complicated, and that's where nutritionists come into play. We are trained, 7 years of school. I hate to say it, but I'm trained to look at poop as well, because that tells me a lot. What does their manure look like?
So TDN is a measurement of, so it tells us how digestible it is. Is that it?
No, it also tells us some energy levels. It's actually an equation that is used and has been used for years. I would say, I think it was developed in the 70s or 80s, but it is an equation that is used to really target digestibility, energy, overall nutritional value of a product. As a nutritionist, in the last 10 years, we've started to get away from that and use more straight energy values, because TDN doesn't tell us the full story. And so we use energy values, we use different fiber values and digestibility values. So we can look at different things and predict performance a little better. I would just say the Pearson Square method for helping you to figure out the protein value of your ration. If you need to balance something, it's great for using 2 ingredients to balance that a little better. But always remember, we need to take into account some other things, the energy levels, digestibility, and honestly, mineral balance gets missed many times when folks look at the very simple side of things with just protein and energy. Grasses and legumes like alfalfa or clover, those are very different in terms of calcium and phosphorus levels, and other minerals as well. So don't set that aside. Make sure you're looking at that, because when it comes to production with gestation and lactation times, we can really run into some issues if you don't have the right mineral balances there too.
Right. I know we've talked about the mineral question some in some previous podcasts, and I think Matt and I would both say that a good mineral is important, but the right mineral is more important probably than.
Oh, I would absolutely agree.
And that comes into this picture of balancing, and balancing is if you have a hole here, you need to fill it with something else basically to balance it.
Sure.
So you offer Small Ruminant Consulting. So what, you want to talk a little bit about what you could offer a farmer in a situation like this?
Yeah. So typically, I offer various packages depending on the farm, in terms of hours of time working with me. We typically spend an hour learning about your farm without physically being there. So I want to learn as much as possible about your farm so that I can really help you and give you, a good result. I want to help you meet your goals. So typically we spend that hour learning about how things work, challenges, goals, what does everyday life look like, when is breeding, weaning, vaccinations, deworming processes, all of that. And, I want to know what the climate's like. The climate, I'm from Southwest Ohio, and the climate there versus 2-3 hours north of me can be very different at times. And so that plays into an animal's performance as well, let alone across the country. So I work with folks all across the US. And so, we work through troubleshooting and meeting whatever goals they want to meet. That may be increasing fertility. It may be resolving health issues. And, it may be just finding a more economical feed. Whether it be grain or hay. We usually, if they have it available, go through forage analysis and seeing where some forages fit better at different times of the year, if that's an option for them. Some folks will ask me to help them plan out their forage for the entire year. They may have options of purchasing different forages. And so we may look at forage analysis and see what forage fits their farm best and which one is worth purchasing.
So a farmer can get their own, pull their samples, submit them, those results can get sent to you, and you can help them work through different scenarios of the best way to use them.
Yes, absolutely. And I have a list of labs that I can recommend as well. And some folks like to have it sent directly to me. Others prefer that it go directly to them and then they just send them my way. Sure. I'm happy to work with either way.
Yeah, very good. So I was curious if you had time to talk about one more thing, and I did not tell you about this, but we talked a little bit on our last podcast about using sodium bicarb.
Mm-hmm.
This time of the year, I hear it again and again. My sheep are really loose. We got green manure, we have dirty tails. I have found that putting free choice sodium bicarb out really makes a difference. Can you explain why? Like I sort of understand the concept. I mean, it's a rumen buffer, but like, can you dig into that just a little bit?
Yeah, so essentially it's like taking Tums. So you and I might get an upset stomach. We might have some acid reflux going on after eating too much spaghetti constantly or something like that. We take Tums. Sodium bicarbonate is essentially the same thing. Animals have an upset stomach. They're going to gravitate towards that sodium bicarbonate. I like to say it's cheap insurance from bloat. However, it's not going to fix all types of bloat. Now, when we just have scouring issues, diarrhea, it can help. Sometimes it may not. It depends on the reason for the scouring. And most often this time of year, especially in the Midwest, where we're getting warmer temperatures, we are seeing the heat stress hit. And so when heat stress hits, we see reduced rumen motility. So that rumen is not moving, not functioning as well as we like because the animal's not moving as much either. And so that slows down digestion. Then we get issues with the scouring. They're just stressed out from the heat. It does tend to help balance those acid levels by putting some sodium bicarbonate out there. The animals, if it's out free choice, the animals will gravitate toward it when they need it. I will say some of the other reasons we see scouring this time of year is because honestly, we're switching diets quickly. And some of that is just our pastures changing quickly. And so we can't always help that. We can't always mediate that by putting out some hay. That's an option. Putting out a little hay to mediate some of that and slow down digestion. Sometimes that grass is just too lush and it just flushes straight through their system. It's so digestible, we just can't keep it in there. And most of the nutrients, if you notice, their manure is probably really green too. The nutrients are just getting passed out the other end because we're not getting it caught in the rumen long enough to digest it all. So in that sense, the sodium bicarb wouldn't always fix the problem.
Right. If you had a little dry hay would help slow that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know,
Process
half
down.
a pound a day will go a very long way.
Yeah. Interesting. 'Cause right now, I think my ewes on pasture are eating volume wise almost the same mineral as they are sodium bicarb. I have one of them mineral feeders, you know, that spins whatever, like keep the mineral out of the weather. And I'll just dump on one side of the feeder. I'll dump sodium bicarb and my free choice mineral on the other side. And they're just about eating it tit for tat.
Okay. So, you know, I would say when that happens, one, it could be because it's getting hot, and sodium bicarb is also a source of salt. And the key is to make sure that they're consuming the right level of mineral and not too much of the sodium bicarb, that they're not getting the amount of mineral they need. Because we don't want them to be shorted on their vitamins and other minerals, as we know that salt regulates intake of mineral.
Right.
So that's important. But, you know, when we see so much, you know, a large amount of sodium bicarb getting consumed, I think as a nutritionist that it's time to look at, okay, how do we mediate whatever's causing them to eat this much? Because in reality, we would like them to not eat all the sodium bicarb.
Right. So it would be interesting if they're eating the sodium bicarb for the salt. It probably doesn't tell me anything which one gets all first. In other words, if I have the mineral and the sodium bicarb side by side, I could say as long as there's mineral left, I know they're getting what they need of the mineral, but probably not if they're eating both of them for salt. They might not pick and choose between them.
They might not. Yeah. Exactly. My biggest concern is that they're eating the sodium bicarb and not eating the mineral that they need. But
I would say they're usually cleaning up the mineral. If I go back, there's a little in the corner, it's usually going to be sodium bicarb. But
so in my experience, it's best to put out enough mineral for a week. So do the math. If your mineral is 2 ounces per head per day, put enough out for a week. Come back and check it. Make sure they're not running out at 6 days or 5 days. And then see at that 7-day mark, is there a lot left over? If you want to measure it, if there is a decent amount, great, then you can find out exactly how much mineral they're eating. But weigh that out. And the key is not to let them run out. So I love talking to 4-H groups and FFA groups and giving this analogy. If you get no candy throughout the year, mom and dad say, nope, you can't have candy throughout the year, but you can have it on Christmas and you can have it on Easter and you can have it on Halloween. Okay. Each of those holidays, as soon as the candy comes out, the kids are typically going to go grab as much as they possibly can and gorge themselves and get stomach aches from eating way too much candy, right? And then the parents have to deal with the sugar high, right? But that's the unfortunate part. But if they have it throughout the year, it's not as big of an excitement and they're not going to run toward it. Let's say they can have a piece of candy once a week or once a day. I'm not going to tell you how to parent, but what I am going to say is if they have consistent availability of something, just like the mineral, they're not going to gorge themselves those few times. But if they're constantly seeing that mineral run out, the next time they see it there, they're going to gorge themselves on it because they think they're not going to get their candy anymore.
Right.
So that's why it's important to always have it available at all times.
Yeah.
So you get consistent intake.
Yep. Hey, that was an interesting breakdown of that sodium bicarb. So, yeah, anything else you want to add yet?
No, other than if anyone wants to contact me, feel free to go to our Facebook page or our website, or you can email me. Our website is Small Ruminant Consulting the email is Small Ruminant Consulting at gmail.com. And the website is smallruminantconsulting.com. And if you don't have a computer, feel free to reach out to me via phone. You can contact Matt or Leon, and they can get you in contact with me as well. But certainly my phone number for our business is 513-205-7992. You can give us a call or text us as well.
All right. There you got it, folks. If you need nutritionalists, feel free to reach out to Barbie and see what she can do for you. Hey, Barbie, it was nice having you on. Thanks again for being willing to do that. And maybe if people have some more questions, maybe we can have you on again to look at something different.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again.